my talk is on GraphQL. It's a different way to API. I'm not sure how many of you are on the Slack for UtahJS, but I put a poll out there. I can't remember when. It was probably before July or something. Just seeing what people's interests were. GraphQL was the one that won. So, just a little bit about myself. You already heard I work at Red Pepper. I'm also an instructor at Dev Mountain. I like to roam Slack. I like to lurk through Slack, I suppose. I've had 3 years of programming in various technologies, my personal website, which I have this lovely icon on there because, well, there's not much to look at. But you get the idea. Usually where I'll be found on the internet is quadruple digit, so before too much longer. If anyone is interested, if they have their computers and that's not about to die and would like to follow along, they can definitely go and clone this repo as I start talking about GraphQL, and we'll get to that example in just a little bit. It is also something good to note that if there is anything that you want to take pictures of during this, and so that you can reference it later, I'm assuming that this is going to still be online later, but if you want to take a picture of it now, you can go ahead and do that. So, first of all, what is GraphQL? When I first heard about it, I thought that it was something that's comparable to SQL. And I found out kind of a lot later, that that's not quite the case. It's a query language for your API. Its purpose is to more or less replace REST. The idea, it's written by Facebook, and the idea is that you have your schema that you set up on your server, and GraphQL uses that to actually get that information. You have to actually provide that the way that it will resolve. So if for that matter, it will work for whatever database you choose. And then the client, when they go to request that information, describes what they want. For instance, in this case, they're looking for a project with the name GraphQL, and they just want the property called tagline. More specifically, if we go back up here, right here is what you'd get back. An object with the project key, and on that object, there's a key called tagline that has that information. The idea is that you can pass information that you are looking for to either restrict what you are getting back or other parameters such as direction through this means. Kind of similar to a function call, but not really. Okay. Differences between what REST and GraphQL are. First of all, the REST format is similar as far as their URLs. The format is, I want this resource. You can optionally have an ID for that resource if you're getting one or affecting one of them. If there's a sub-resource, you can have it based off of that. And then finally, you can have an ID off of that if there's a collection and whatnot. This can be a little bit difficult to set up and have work actually fairly decently well. The functionality isn't triggered just by the URL, but also the HTTP method, either get, put, patch, post, delete, any one of those. The backend gives you the information it fetches from the database. But if you want other resources populated on it, you either have to have the backend do that by default, or you might have some special way of explaining what fields that you want, or you don't want it to go too deep, or you want these fields to populate which wouldn't normally, and all that kind of thing. It's kind of a little bit. It can be a little bit difficult to deal with. Otherwise, you get the IDs back, or you get a URL, depending on which version that you go for, and the backend will fulfill that, but in a separate request. As such, it's generally going to be a little bit more difficult to be able to get that kind of information from a client's perspective. On GraphQL's end, it doesn't care what URL or method or even protocol that you use as long as it goes through the GraphQL engine. You can describe what you want, and it fetches it for you, no more or less. You can get nested resources by querying them on the type, but you do have to be mindful. As backend developers, this isn't quite as simple as it sounds. Since it doesn't actually go to your database and integrate with your database, you have to probably implement something to resolve and populate those subfields. So for that matter, be mindful of that. I wish it kind of was as simple as it sounds, but it isn't quite that way. One of the root things that, as far as the backend is concerned, uses a schema. You can set up your schema in this in two different ways by default. Either you have a string that has that GraphQL syntax. You're specifying that this is going to be of an input type. This is the name of what it's going to be. This is a field that's going to be on it, and there's a string, and it has to be there, and so on and so forth. You can also, instead, do it in an object-oriented programming way, where you have the name you create a new input object type with the name of user input. You have these fields. Make sure that it's a non-null string, and so on and so forth. This way is obviously a lot simpler. However, with this object-oriented way, you do have the ability to do fancy things with it. Maybe do some introspection to your database and have it populate the schema according to what it finds in the database. This, as you can probably see, is probably really useful. But typing this out, especially for such a small and not quite as complex API, you probably won't want to do this. You'll probably want to do it the string way. During my research on this, the string way is recommended at first, but then as time goes on and you might need to have more complex structures, as well as resolvers, then you should use the objects instead. As far as I've been able to tell, you cannot use both at the same time. I could be wrong about this, and so if somebody here is a buff in GraphQL, please let me know. But I have not really been able to find much in that way. Types. These are different types that you can specify in your schema. First of all is just a generic type. It explains the shape of an object you will be receiving or sending back from the database. Scalar is a different thing. It's a single value that sometimes will have to be handled a little bit differently. It depends. They already have, or GraphQL comes with several built-in scalars, such as an int, float, string, or Boolean, or ID, which are useful, but there are some times when there's a value that you can't really quite as well express with an object type that you might need to serialize or deserialize. In this case, I'm talking about date. If there's a date field and you need to change it from string into an object, all you have to do is specify a scalar, and then you'll have to do something to serialize it or deserialize it on your own. Enum is basically what it sounds like, an enumerated list, things that you would expect to have come in that don't necessarily have an ID or something like that. So something simple. You don't always use this, and you probably will use an ID a lot of times, but there are cases when an enum is useful. A union is kind of like an amalgamation of all of these types. You stick a bunch of them together, and then that's what you're going to be using for this. It could be any one of these things, kind of thing. Interface is a type, but not one that you can actually use in a schema when setting up what this field is going to resolve to. It's more or less just to enforce a certain style or shape in an object. You use it to implement on types. We might be able to see a little bit of an example of that, but we'll see. On the client side, there are really two different kinds of queries. One of them is just simply called query, and it's the primary way to get data from an API, basically HTTP/REST's version of a GET. We'll see some of how these work in just a little bit. For mutations, on the other hand, it's like your posts, puts, gets, deletes, or post, puts, patch, deletes. All of the things that actually modify data in your backend. With that really quick rundown, let's actually go look at some code. So, this is actually the project that I have put together for this. A few different things to explain about this. First of all, we have a React front end that will be doing things with the API with, and we'll be setting up our GraphQL in this file right here. Right now, we don't have any GraphQL specified. I am using Express, and I'm using certain things that will be simpler to use just to get an idea of what's happening. So, first of all, let's talk about schemas. Now, I'm going to cheat just a little bit, and then I can just kind of walk through some of the different kinds, because I don't have enough time to go through and custom write all of these out. Let's paste it. And rename it to schemas. Let's talk about some of the different things. In this case, it's just a simple user kind of management thing. It's not really too fancy. The whole point is to be able to do something with just users. In this particular case, we have a type. This type is a user, and it has these fields on it, similar to what I showed just a little bit ago. All of these things are required to be provided to GraphQL, even if you don't actually want them every single time. It's implementing this user interface, which is right here. Basically, we'll have the same fields, and interfaces are more or less more useful when you have multiple types that are going to be implementing this interface. In this particular case, it's not really as useful. I just did this and so that you could see that this is an interface. You don't really use it anywhere else other than implementing it into types, saying these are the fields that I'm expecting to have in this type. If you don't have them quite right, then it will throw an error saying that there's a problem. The input types, which I actually realized that I left out of the slide, are ones that are specifically for data that you are expecting from the clients. So, mutations, these are going to be coming in the form of these inputs. Inputs cannot use interfaces, at least at this point. I don't know if they'll ever get to that point. And so, as such, you do have to be careful about this and making sure that it is matching somewhat what you're going to be looking for in your endpoint. There's also the scalar, and as I was explaining, you just have a date. In this particular case, there's nothing more than just scalar name, because it's expected that you will be doing something to serialize or deserialize it, and there's nothing more that you can really expect from GraphQL itself. In this particular case, I also have an enum saying these are two different ways that we can either we can order by either ascending or descending, either way. Last of all of these I'm somewhat implicitly importing into this schema. The schema, this is how things are set up. You have a type that's a query, and everything that's going to be queried will be through this. These are basically your methods to get things. In this case, we can just have simply a hello, which will be resolving to a string. This user is going to be expecting an ID, which is of type int, but if there isn't one, it's going to get a default one. You'll see that even though we have this exclamation point in some places, we don't have it here. That's meaning that this is an optional parameter. And it will always resolve into a user. With the users, we can specify a direction about whether we want it to be loaded by the way that it was inserted or the reverse. And it will always be a list with users. You can also specify this to not have any exclamation points. That just means that they can be nullable. Other than that, it doesn't really matter. It really will depend on which one, however you need to set up your schema. Mutation is another one of those types. Just as I was explaining, you can specify these are the different things that will change things in our database, either adding, deleting, or updating a user. If we're able to get through it, then we'll be able to see how all of these things are working. Okay. There's only one other thing that I forgot to import just a minute ago. We're going to bring in Express GraphQL. And all we need to do in order to do that, or to use it, is just go down here and do app.use GraphQL, and then we can pass in an object. We also need to have a resolver object. Basically, I'm going to call it root. Basically what that is that this is an object with a bunch of methods on it that will resolve in certain things. So for instance, let's have it match what we have over here. Add user, which has to match this add user, which actually, let's start with hello. It will be a method. Usually what happens is that you have this root, which in all technicality is going to be, actually this is arguments. This is going to be your request. So in the terms of Express, that's your rack object. You can get anything else from there or put anything else on there if you want. It doesn't really matter. And all we'll do is return hello. We're going to have to put, oh, that's right. Excuse me. Express GraphQL. On the root value, we'll put in that root resolver. We'll bring in graphical. And I know I'm missing just one more thing. The schema, that is right. So we have all of these different GraphQL files. Let's pull them in. I'm using a package to just go and grab all of the GraphQL and bring them in. And then I'm going to be taking GraphQL and building the schema. In which case, I also need to make sure that GraphQL is also up here. Okay. Perfect. Now, let me reset the server real quick. Once it's back up, import schemas, not a function. Oh, that's right. Live coding. And stir schema is not defined. Oh, that's right. That's the problem with copying and pasting. Don't do it. Start the server up. You also need to make sure that it says true. And this should be everything. Go on. There we go. Now, this is also one of the things that is very useful when it comes to GraphQL. You do have the ability to have more or less a REPL that you can go in and play around with. For instance, if you are interested in knowing what you need or what is available, you can go over here to where it says docs and click on it. Click query, and you'll see all of the things that you can do in it. Technically, we haven't made any resolvers for anything else, so we can only really try this hello. So start by going query, hello, and looky there. Data comes through exactly as I sent it through. You'll see that by default, it will come through on a data property called data, and then after that, it's going to match exactly the structure that you specified over here in your query. So now that we have that, let's go ahead and quickly throw this in too. Call it the same. Restart the server. Okay. Now, let me just grab users. And since it's going to be coming through as a list, we want to specify what we want to see from them. We want the first name, last name, and ID, I suppose. And you'll see here that it gives us a list. By default, I just put a simple object in there. Simon Tuttle, I guess, is his name. And you can see that that works. Now, though I do not have much time left, let me see if I can't quickly put in these things. On my React side, I've created this services folder. And in it, we have a base fetch operation whose purpose is to actually send the request. Then I have these other functions whose whole purpose is to just simply put the data into those fields. you can see that we have mutations and queries. And let's see. We also need to grab this configuration. Stick it here. And we should have all of those components. Now, in our app.js, we're also going to grab this fetch users, put it in here, and component will mount will fetch the users. User service is not defined. We can fix that. Actually, it would be this. Making sure what's happening. We have this GraphQL that we see that has been sent out. The query has gone through as a string, and the users have come back in this state. Let's see. We fetch the users. Let's go take a look at React. Our state. Okay. Okay. Instead of data, let's go to users. Thank you. And now we have it. As such, there's not really too much to it. There are a lot of different useful tools that you can use. If you're using React, there's something called Relay. If you're using React or Angular or even just vanilla JavaScript, I think even they might have a view binding too. There's the Apollo. If you're doing stuff with the backend, there's a Prisma ORM right here. You also have the ability to use GraphQL, which is, I think it's like Prisma, or it might be using Prisma under the hood, but it's a cloud solution as well. And yeah, it's not really too difficult. The idea here in this case is that I'm going to maybe finish this example up and have it in that repo that we have right here. And once I have that in there, then you can be able to look at all of the different things that you can do with GraphQL. I also put together another more advanced example that also has that actually uses Postgres and a few other things. I was also going to have it use Redis or plain objects or Mongo, just so that you can see that it could be used everywhere. It's not quite yet done, but as such, GraphQL, really cool tool, very simple API, makes client requests a whole lot easier. You still have to do some stuff on the back end, but at the same time, very useful. It's not a tool for everything, so be mindful of that. This particular article will also explain that a little bit better in detail. Either way, thank you for having me.
much.